housekeeping. Well,
Yeah. All right. So just while we get that one ready for the audience joining us online, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes for those of you with us tonight. There are toilet facilities available in the bathroom, so please feel free to get up and excuse yourself if you need to. And tonight, because we've got such a great turnout here, we want to allow as much time for audience Q&A as possible. So please, if you think of any questions, please hang on to it and we will try to get to a chance to come to the audience so you'll have a chance to ask your questions directly as much as possible. All right, I'll begin. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Mari Kirk. I'm the Director of Engagement and Impact here at the United States Study Center. And tonight we are looking at our 2024 Election Watch kickoff event, Biden versus Trump redux, ? Most likely. But just before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. So as we look ahead to this election year, which I think, the group that we have here tonight shows how keenly invested Australian audiences are in watching what happens in the US. I think we know that this year is going to be another very big, exciting election year. And it is going to be one of the most contentious and controversial. If you, in the 2020 election, got sick of the word unprecedented, I think you need to strap in because we're going to be hearing that a lot again. If we just look at, the age of the two leading candidates who are most likely to be the nominees, their combined age on election day would be 159 years old. And we are also looking at having major criminal trials underway while the selection process is taking place. And even before we get to that, next week we have a Supreme Court case that is deciding whether the most likely nominee for one of the parties will be eligible to be on the ballot in some states. So there are a lot of big questions, constitutional questions, and understanding, the American democratic process. How does this work out? Things are being tested like never before. And I think in moments like this, where there are so many things that maybe haven't been seen before or are being tested, that's where we feel that the United States Study Center can really play a role in helping to provide analysis and insight. Everything we do is based on evidence and the best information we can find available. And we want to kind of translate that, make it digestible, and then help you understand, and not just going beyond the facts of what's going on, but really what does it mean here in Australia, in the region, and globally as well. So for this year, just a heads up on some of the big election watch activities that'll be happening with the US Study Center this year. The big election milestones to note will be, we've got what normally is Super Tuesday in March, which is now almost a super week because the first Trump trial is supposed to kick off on the 4th of March. Super Tuesday is the following day, the 5th of March. The State of the Union is scheduled that week as well on the 7th of March. So that first week of March is going to be very busy and we'll be doing things for that. The Republican National Convention is happening in July, the Democratic Convention in August. In September, we have the kickoff of the first presidential debates, which are always exciting to watch. And then, of course, the election itself will occur on the 5th of November. So we'll be there every step along the way. We'll be having events like this, but I also encourage you to be tapping into some of our other resources as well. We will be publishing a new version of, I realized this was from 2020, Red Book, Blue Book, an Australian guide to the next US administration. And oh, look, we've got Biden and Trump on the cover. I was like, maybe we don't need to update it. We could just republish our 2020 version. But we'll be publishing that for an understanding of kind of what to expect, what's at stake based on which administration comes into office. We also have some fantastic explainers and trackers that are getting updated on the website. I highly commend the presidential, or a guide to the next US presidential election, which you can find on the homepage of the website, and it's done by research associates Sam Garrett and Ava Kalanaskis. And that one guides you through everything. It's the primaries, but also it talks about the Trump trials. It talks about everything that's coming up. So it's a great breakdown sequentially of what we're looking at in this election cycle. And then just this afternoon, they have launched, they were doing like GOP candidate tracker and where they stood on different issues, and tracking that as we went. But now we're pivoting, and now we've got a Trump tracker. And we're just looking at Trump, what he said on all the big issues, from everything from Ukraine and Taiwan to abortion and immigration. So they're looking at what he has said on the public record, where he stands on those issues, and they'll be updating it as we go. So those are great resources. And then the last couple things I'll point you to, if you're a US politics junkie, can't get enough of the kind of thing we're doing here tonight. We have got a newsletter called the 46th, because currently we have the 46th presidential administration in power. And so it goes out weekly on Wednesdays. And if you want the latest on developments in US politics and things that the presidential administration touches, I encourage you to subscribe to the 46, which is curated by Victoria, who's on the panel tonight. And then also we have a new podcast called the USSC Briefing Room that Victoria, Jared, and I all run, and David is a regular on the podcast, and you'll get your latest on US news and foreign policy. So if you're into those things, those are some of the resources that will be available this year. We will also be publishing a polling report later this year, as we usually do. So stay tuned for that. And we're going to have big events. Our large conference for the year, the Sydney International Strategy Forum, will happen after the election. So we can bring out some experts and insiders from the US to analyze what just happened and really what does this mean as we transition. Okay, so that's enough plugs for what USSC is doing. I want to transition over to our panel now. Joining me tonight, we've got Jared Mondschein, who is the Director of Research with the Center. He also heads up our Politics, Society, and Culture program. So you'll frequently hear him on the news, often ABC, SBS, even BBC. And he covers a wide range of issues, but he's an American who knows the politics through and through, and he heads up our polling every year. So if you've got a polling question, Jared's your guy. Next, we have Victoria Cooper, who is the research editor with the Center. And like I said, she looks after the 46 that goes out every week on Wednesday, but she's also a part of the Politics, Society, and Culture team, providing her analysis and insights, closely tracking the US election and other developments in US politics. So she's across it, and she's frequently commenting on media as well. And then finally, one of our most prolific voices at the Center, we have Associate Professor David Smith, who is jointly shared with the University of Sydney's Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. He's Associate Professor in Foreign Policy and US Politics. And you regularly hear him on ABC Drive on Tuesday afternoons, talking about the latest. And he is across not just, the knowledge he contains in his brain about what's going on right now is truly amazing. But if you multiply that towards all the years of US history, he can kind of tap into any year and tell you what it means in historical context. So we're very excited to have them on the panel tonight. So thank you so much for joining us. Okay, so I'm going to kick off just talking a little bit about where we are right now. We have just finished the first two official competitions of this election. We had the Iowa caucuses and followed the next week by the New Hampshire primaries. And for those of you who don't know, the caucuses are an unbelievable experience. They're quite rowdy. You go into a room like this with your whole neighborhood, and they're like, okay, if you're voting for this person, go into that corner. If you're voting for this person, go into that corner. And they have to get a majority, and they'll be, cajoling and trying to get people into this corner. And it's very wild what happens on those nights. So it's very different to going into a primary where you go and you cast a ballot, much like you would normally see in an election. And the Iowa caucuses were called for Trump winning the Republican vote for that state. It was called after only 31 minutes after the polls closed. So that was fast, especially compared to 2020, where it took several days, I think weeks even, before they were called. So 31 minutes, does that quick turnaround, does that reveal anything significant about, and how could they even call it that quickly with such a complicated system? Over to anyone.
The Iowa caucuses were very closely in line with polls that for weeks had shown that Trump was going to win a decisive victory there. Not as decisive as he would have wanted. His campaign put a very happy face on it. Trump concealed his frustration very well. He didn't conceal it so well after New Hampshire. It's not enough for him to get above 50% of the vote. he wants to completely annihilate the field. He
Mm.
wants the appearance of unanimity in the Republican electorate, and it's frustrating him that he's not getting it. Now, when it comes to a general election, the vast majority of those who voted for candidates are still going to vote for Trump. But he would certainly be annoyed about the fact that he didn't get more of the vote than that. And it will be very interesting to see how long basically Nikki Haley stays around to irritate him, given that she doesn't really have a chance of actually winning the competition. But Iowa turnout was significantly lower than it had been in previous competitive contests. It was 187,000 people. In 2016, it was just over 120,000 this time around. And that reflected partly the absolutely frigid temperatures in Iowa. It was sub-zero, that's sub-zero Fahrenheit. Now, I've experienced that kind of weather in Michigan before. When the wind starts to blow in those temperatures, gloves are useless. The interesting bit of trivia, Iowa is closer to the equator than it is to the North Pole, but the problem is there's nothing between Iowa and the Pole. So I can understand the weather keeping people away. But the other thing is people realized it was not a competitive contest. And I think that this realization took hold among the Republican electorate a lot earlier than it did in the media, where there's still an interest in the idea that there's an actual competition going on. But I think not only was the Iowa race called very quickly for Trump, that especially in conjunction with the New Hampshire result, which if he was going to lose anywhere, it was going to be there, I think really showed that there's no way that he can actually lose the nomination. The question is, how long can this contest drag on and potentially damage him?
That's interesting because, yeah, DeSantis officially pulled out of the race after the Iowa caucuses, and he was the most likely, or he pitched himself as the, Trump alternative and more Trumpy than Trump in some ways and some policies. He dropped out, so it was two people going into New Hampshire. But it was a lot closer in New Hampshire. But is it a two-horse race, or are you all in agreement it's over and done? Nikki Haley or no other candidate stands a chance at this stage? Is there any glide path where she might have a chance at grabbing the nomination at this stage?
So I want to say yes because I'm so bored. I think if you subscribe to the 46th, another plug, my title for that week of Iowa was Trump wins Iowa yawn. Like, I'm so bored. And New Hampshire offered a glimmer of like a heart rate elevating moment where it was like maybe Nikki Haley might not win, but narrow the margin enough to give. That's essentially what we're looking at when it comes to South Carolina. Nevada's this weird case where the caucus counts, but the primary doesn't count, but Nikki Haley isn't at the caucus. So it's kind of a case closed. So South Carolina on the 24th of February is what we're all looking at. But essentially at this stage, what we're looking at is momentum. And Nikki Haley did get some momentum in New Hampshire. I don't want to discount her entirely and do what Trump did and say that she came out and claimed a victory, but I won. Because in some senses, Nikki Haley did win. Trump's team was expecting the margin between Trump and Nikki Haley to be something like 22%. And she managed to narrow that down to more like 12, 11%, which is a big victory for her team, especially considering that she's basically fighting the incumbent, and that she managed to co-opt a lot of people who decided within a week of the New Hampshire primary that they were going to go out and vote. So something like 77% of those people who decided within the week that they were going to go to the new primary election voted for Nikki Haley, and something like 60% of independent voters also voted for Nikki Haley. But that's why New Hampshire was her moment, is because it has an uncanny amount of independent voters and is known for doing things like this, where you get a different result in Iowa to New Hampshire. So, I mean, is the race over now? Well, that's why we're looking to South Carolina. And, it's Nikki Haley's home state and she's not performing too well. And not to mention, yeah, it's a two-horse race, but that means Nikki Haley is now confronting the undiluted force of the Trump campaign. And I think that creates new barriers. And not to mention, as we say, this is about momentum, and Trump is driving an absolute speedboat. And no matter how much you try and like swim, because she's definitely not in a boat. No matter how much she swims, it's going to be very, very difficult for her to catch up. So, and disappointingly, I think the rest of the primaries are going to look a bit like a yawn fest, but it will be interesting to see kind of how Trump, I don't know, manages this irritant, if we want to call Nikki Haley's campaign an irritant, and perhaps more broadly how that plays out in a future race between Trump and Biden.
So if Trump is driving a speedboat, we're about to hit a gauntlet of some of these potential obstacles to that speedboat. I mean, the first one being the Supreme Court case next week, but then we've got his trials commencing supposedly in March, although it sounds like at least some of them will be delayed because of the appeals process and things happening around that. What role would those play, I guess, in terms of this momentum? And if Trump is the dominating force, how likely are these legal challenges going to be to either deter Trump or potentially, give Haley a boost in some way, or do they help Trump? Like, what are those going to do to Trump's speedboat momentum?
One thing that I like to tell folks in terms of the environment we're in is how shocking it was in the 2016 presidential election. There was that first debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and how it was remarkable to me that how we perceived it differently. Everyone had a different take on it. I had friends who were Trump supporters say that was an amazing showing. And if folks don't remember, it was Trump where he was belittling her and interrupting her the whole time. And we'd never seen a debate like that before. So my Trump friends were saying, this is amazing. This is what we've been waiting for all my life. This is what we wanted. And this is, he's making fun of this entire charade that is US politics. Clinton voters were saying, oh, this is obvious that she's more presidential. She's more accomplished. She was staying on topic. And it was this Rorschach test. And it's the same thing with the mugshot. It's the same thing with the trials. I'm seeing my MSNBC watching friends say, I can't believe they could vote for this criminal. Look at this mugshot. I'm going to get it on my t-shirt and literally on a mug or a mugshot. And then my Fox News watching friends saying, I can't believe this weaponized justice system. This image of a former president getting a mugshot is exactly what is evidence of how biased the whole system is, and everything is against him. So when I get asked that question, my question back is, which audience are we trying to win? So amongst Republicans, I think it's basically accepted as common agreement that or Republican pollsters, I should say, every single news item on the trial helped Trump with Republicans. Every single one. I don't see any single trial news item that ever hurt Trump with Republicans. You saw all his opponents within the Republican who are also going for the presidency of the GOP nomination begrudgingly and frustratingly say, oh man, this is not great. Trump is completely in the right here, and this is a completely biased judicial system. They didn't want to give him that press coverage, but they had to. Whereas the Democrats, they see these trials and they think that this is the worst, this is terrible, this is unbelievable behavior by a former president. And so the question is with an election in 2020 that was decided by about 43,000 votes spread across 3 states. Remember, the popular vote doesn't matter. It's the Electoral College. 43,000 votes spread across 3 states. Does Trump win those independent voters that he needs to win in 2024? I am not sure if he does with these trials. I don't think they help him in the same way. With that said, it's important to note you're going to hear that stat a lot about those independent voters, about the Electoral College. We should not think of these independent voters as these highly thoughtful, intellectual folks. These are busy Americans trying to do their job. And they're what you call low information voters. They're working 2 jobs. They're single parents. They don't know who they're going to vote for, but it's not because they're waiting to see if Trump is going to change, interest rates on tax liabilities. No, they don't know, and they don't really care. So anyone who says confidently Trump is these trials are terrible or are amazing, I think is lying, because we don't know how in a population of the US with, hundreds of millions of Americans, how can you decide about 43,000 Americans and where they're going to vote?
And we've talked about this for a few years now at the US Study Center. And David, I'm keen to get your thoughts on this, but we've talked about, the future of the Republican Party, with the MAGA movement, Make America Great Again. There's been tension within the party. Which direction is it going to go? So if Trump wins the nomination now, does that effectively seal the future of the Republican Party for this next phase? Does it settle that argument and say, okay, this is settled, MAGA and Trump is the Republican Party now? Is that where it's trending if he wins the nomination?
That future only lasts as long as he lives. What holds MAGA together is Trump's charismatic authority. And Trump tends to focus a lot of the attention on himself, his personal grievances, his personality. When you look at everybody who is under the umbrella of the MAGA movement, you've got everybody from these conservative traditionalists who want a welfare state that will make sure that only one member of every family needs to work. Then you've got the libertarians who want as little government involvement in the economy as possible. You've got all kinds of opportunists who've just seen Trump as their opportunity. You've got the white nationalists. You've got people who see Trump as just the revenge against the system. There's so many different and often very conflicting strands of political thought and political emotion going on under the umbrella of MAGA. It is Trump that actually brings it all together. When Trump is gone, and I think he will continue to be the authority probably for as long as he lives, when he's gone, there's going to be a tremendous vacuum of authority. And there are all kinds of people who are positioning themselves to fill that vacuum. You look at the number of really quite young Republicans, people like Elise Stefanik, who's in her late 30s, who's risen already to become the number 3 Republican in the House, or someone like J.D. Vance, who's I think only just turned 40, has won a Senate seat in Ohio, which he'll probably have for as long as he wants it. They have really positioned themselves just very, very, very close to Trump. They've potentially got very long political futures in front of them, certainly a lot longer than the rest of Trump's career or lifespan is going to be, and they're positioning themselves to step in. But it's going to be complete chaos when Trump is gone because people have projected so many different things onto Trump. Can you imagine the kind of debates of people trying to claim the mantle of Trump, to claim the true, what was it that Trump really stood for? And so I think that authority covers up a lot of the divisions that are actually in the Republican Party at the moment, which I think that, Trump is a future, but he's a medium-term future at best. Not that I think that Biden is particularly the future of anything either. This election does not seem to me to be a battle for the future. It's a battle for the prolonging of this short-term situation, which people are increasingly sick of.
If I can just add, I think it's important to note, as much as Trump has been a unifier of the Republican Party, and I fully agree with David that I can't see it lasting beyond his lifespan, despite how much his sons may want to take that mantle. It's important to note that for the Democrats, he's also a unifier. Yeah. For those who follow U.S. politics, there's a common phrase: Democrats in disarray. They were always fighting with each other. They always had the worst party discipline. You couldn't agree on anything. They were disagreeing on everything. But David has made this point, and I think it's a really good one, about the margin in the House that the Democrats had in 2020 versus the margins that the Republicans got in 2022. It was the same 5-seat majority. So the Dems had a 5-seat majority in 2020, Republicans had a 5-seat majority in 2022. And the difference in what they did with that majority I think is telling. The Democrats, I've never seen them in my lifetime so unified. And just in the way that we're seeing a president with an approval rating in the high 30s, low 40s, facing no real challenger for that nomination. It's not that the other Democrats are scared of Biden. I don't think anyone is really scared of Biden. I think they're scared of being the person who weakens Biden against Trump. That is what unifies them more than anything else right now.
Well, that segues perfectly into my next question, because I am keen to talk about Biden as well, not just Trump all the time, which it feels like is inevitable, and we do. But Biden and his strategy for this campaign, he was vying for Trump to secure the Republican nomination because he thinks he has beat Trump before, so he's got a proven track record. So if it's a Biden versus Trump rematch, then Biden wins in his mind. But also because there's that sense that like that is the thing that can help him secure the victory, if it is him versus Trump. Do you guys agree with that assessment? And does Trump winning the nomination play into Biden's hand, or is it going to be more contested than that? Like, is it we've already had this match, we know the outcome, or is it still a level of uncertainty going into election day?
I think negative partisanship, being the idea that you're not voting for Biden, but you're voting against Trump, is absolutely going to play in Biden's favor. Whether or not that's actually enough to win him the election, I think is a separate question. I think a big thing to remember is like, while the candidates may be the same as 2020, 2024 is a completely different context to 2020. We're not dealing with a global pandemic or a so-called basement campaign from Joe Biden. Biden is now the incumbent, not Trump, as much as Trump is trying to pitch it as if he is the incumbent and is also making directives as if he is still currently the president. I think those things are really important consideration, and it is far too soon to know about how, especially these legal cases, are going to play into those big questions about not just Trump's eligibility to run, and a lot of constitutional questions that make me no longer feel like an expert, because oh my goodness, no one knows what what kind of constitutional debates are going to have to be settled and which way those debates are going to go. But I think the point I'm trying to make is there's still a lot of questions, but everyone's kind of decided on where they stand on Trump and Biden. You know, I don't think anyone's enthusiastically voting for Biden because they just absolutely love Biden. I think they're probably voting for Biden because they cannot fathom another 4 years of Trump. And I think the reverse is the same for Republicans. But with that all said, I think a lot of people, if you're not looking at 2020 for president, perhaps you're looking at the 2022 midterms. And everyone said, okay, well then the anti-MAGA coalition worked really well for the Democrats. Democrats managed to hold on to not a House majority, but a Senate majority, and narrow that, or just dissolve the supposed red wave that was going to happen by, you know, retaining a smaller margin in the House in 2022. Because so many Trump-like extremists were on the ballot, and that really helped them. But I think what we're looking at there is encouraged turnouts from people who are politically engaged Democrats. And I think that's where the polling discrepancies at this stage, even though it's still too soon to really rely on them to get an indicator of what's going to happen at the end of the year. When you're looking at that kind of turnout, because elections aren't compulsory, these are people who are already sort of passionate. They're already motivated to turn out. These are the people who are turning out in off-cycle elections in places and ballot elections on issues like abortion. And those voters are always going to vote for Biden because they're always going to vote against Trump. The demographics that Biden is now struggling with, he relied on to win in 2020. It's populations like younger voters and Black community that aren't guaranteed to turn out and often have a harder time turning out in elections. And I think those demographics are ones to watch in terms of whether they're going to passionately enough back Biden against Trump at the end of the year. I think that's kind of where I'd be looking.
So there are a lot of polls done of hypothetical matchups. And according to these polls, the two most popular candidates in the country are two candidates that you've never heard of before. Their names are generic Republican and generic Democrat. When you have actual people with these head-to-head polls. You tend to see none of them are very popular. But when you have Biden versus generic Republican wins by 17 points or something like that. Trump versus generic Democrat wins by 15 points. I think that it's very, very difficult to predict this contest, and I'm not going to try. But according to those polls, Republicans would have actually had a much better chance with Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley really seemed to, and I think this was reflected in the strength of her independent vote in New Hampshire, for a lot of voters at this point who just want something new. Nikki Haley would have offered that in all kinds of ways, probably even to voters who, if they actually knew what she believed in, would disagree with a lot of it. Interestingly, so Ron DeSantis also started out as massively outperforming Trump. By the time the Iowa polls rolled around, no longer. He was actually underperforming Trump. And I remember his campaign saying, because of the nature of the Iowa caucus that Murray talked about and how long candidates spend in Iowa, and they make a point of visiting all 99 counties. And his campaign said, every Republican caucus voter in Iowa has met Ron DeSantis or has had a chance to meet him. And that's probably why 80% of them voted against him. I have never seen a major candidate with less charisma. I've had viral infections with more charisma than DeSantis.
One thing to flag, I think, just on the state of the GOP is, my team's heard me say this a lot, but it's important to flag. Trump's approval ratings amongst Republicans, even in the days after January 6, 2021, have never gone below 74%. Never gone below 74%. Nikki Haley's favorability has never gone above 52%. And her unfavorability is increasing at the moment, right at 24, now up to 26%. And it's gone up 11% in just the last year. There's I've said this before, David's heard me say this, but there's a great American band called Wilco, and they're from Chicago, so I'm a big fan. But they have this one song called "Ashes of American Flags," and in that song, he uses the lyrics, "All my lives are only wishes." As much as Republicans would love, like that 20 to 30% of Republicans who can't stand Trump, as much as they, when they go on TV, talk about the awakening in the Republican Party and it's shifting, I just don't see it coming. And I don't think any of us saw it coming, even in the days after January 6th. I've been watching that approval rating amongst Republicans like a hawk, and it has never dipped, and that tells you everything about what the Republican Party is today. With that said, that's the Republican Party, and who self-identifies as a Republican is very different than where the rest of the country is, including conservatives, including self-described conservatives, self-described centrists. So just in terms of the Republican Party and where that is, that's one thing, but there's a lot more to discuss beyond just that.
Yeah, and I want to pivot to something we have talked about a little bit, but it's kind of the next big thing that's coming up aside from South Carolina and Nevada. But next week, oral arguments start with the Supreme Court. Considering this case that's brought about the 14th Amendment, where the state of Colorado ruled that Trump was ineligible to appear on the ballot because he had participated in insurrection. And the 14th Amendment was created after the Civil War to say that anyone who official office of the United States who participated in an insurrection would not be eligible to hold certain offices. And so that was mostly used after the Civil War and looking at people who tried to secede from the Union. But now the state of Colorado decided that, okay, Trump participated in this insurrection and he is not eligible. He cannot appear in our battle or on our Supreme Court, or sorry, he cannot appear on our ballot. So now it is going to the Supreme Court. And Colorado is the only state where it's gone through that process of doing it. The state of Maine also, based on how it stands, where in their state, someone made the decision for the same reason. He cannot appear on the ballot, but they've also said they'll follow the decision of the Supreme Court. So it's a complicated, standing, which is testing the Constitution. Now, the majority of states have not said that there's an issue with Trump appearing on the ballot. So most of the states, it's fine for him to appear on the ballot. Is there I know none of us are constitutional experts, but in terms of how the Supreme Court will consider it, is there any case where they could make a constitutional case for him having to be removed if the majority of states have all said that it's okay? And with this, and especially given the makeup of the court right now, is there, it just seems, to me, it seems hard to imagine an outcome where the court would actually say, no, he's totally ineligible.
Yeah, it is hard to imagine. When you look at the Colorado decision, it was a very close decision. It was 4-3. That's from 7 judges who were all appointed by Democratic governors. Whereas the Supreme Court, you've got 6 of them appointed by Republicans. So I think it's very unlikely. There are 3 very complicated questions involved. One is, was Trump involved in an insurrection? The second one is, given that Congress actually has the power to stop someone from running, does any court have that same power? And the third, which is absolutely bizarre, is Trump an officer of the United States? Now, you might think, yes, of course he is. He's the officer of the United States. But apparently it's way more complicated than that. I've heard Chaz Licciardello explain this in a great deal of detail and excitement, and I still couldn't quite follow it. But I think some people argue it's to do with the president taking a different oath of office from all other officers of the United States. And that might seem weird, but it's a very live issue in a lot of places where this has gone to courts, mainly below the level of state Supreme Courts. That's actually been the key issue. Given that given that you have these 3 questions where the court basically needs to say yes to all of them, I think it's very unlikely that 5 out of the Supreme Court justices are going to say yes to all 3 of those questions. Having said that, though, and I don't want to give anyone hope that that's going to happen, but there's something that is worth noting about the Supreme Court, which is Trump has appointed not only 3 Supreme Court justices, but also hundreds of federal judges who have now made it a lot easier to make very conservative policy in the United States. And that part of that was basically the agreement that Trump had with the Federalist Society going into the 2016 election, that he would choose judges from these lists drawn up by the conservative legal establishment. That was one of the things that made conservatives see him as a safe pair of hands going into the 2016 election. That played a huge role. He's now really split from the Federalist Society. And one of the reasons was that during the 2020 election, it suddenly turned out all of these judges that he had appointed at the federal level and at the Supreme Court were not prepared to entertain any of his bullshit about the 2020 election. Those 60 or so cases, most of those were heard by at least some judges who were appointed by him. All of them said no. The one that made it to the Supreme Court, I think Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito were prepared to think about it. Not the 3 that he actually appointed. And we're potentially looking at this very interesting scenario if there's a second Trump presidency, where he's actually created a new conservative legal establishment that is certainly going to facilitate conservative policy, but is actually not going to indulge his personal ambitions. And because these are, serious legal-minded people, and a substantial amount of Trump's career has been based on finding ways around the law. So there's potentially some very interesting conflict on the way if there actually is a second Trump term between Trump and the people that he's actually appointed.
Okay, now to turn back to Biden a little bit, because then we get to the week of Super Tuesday, which, like I mentioned, so many things happening that week. Super Tuesday happens on Tuesday the 5th. Biden will give his State of the Union address, possibly his final State of the Union address, on Thursday the 7th of March. Can Biden cut through the noise that will be happening as we're gearing up around the Trump trials and the primaries and everything? Can Biden cut through with his State of the Union message? What can he hope to achieve at that time?
I think one thing that we can expect Biden to do in his State of the Union speech is outline a kind of second term agenda. I think that's kind of classic for first term presidents to try and lay out their second term agenda. And the reason I think that's going to be particularly tricky for Biden at the moment is because I think what voters care about is the economy. And in terms of cutting through, that message is falling on deaf ears. And also often has quite a bit to do with foreign policy. And at this point in time, that is also an incredibly difficult calculation for Biden to make, both in terms of responding to, you know, events that just happened this week, but also in terms of appealing to voters where they're at on foreign policy. I was reading today that a lot of how Biden has been framing his foreign policy is kind of this fight for democracy. And he's framed it in that way in terms of the US supporting Ukraine and the US supporting Taiwan. And that message isn't necessarily resonating with Americans because they don't look overseas and see a battle for democracy and really resonate with that kind of message in the same way that they did maybe 20 years ago. And if anything, the turn has in the American public has been for more American isolationism and more of a calculated approach to when America commits itself overseas. And you can see these kind of wedge issues emerging in Congress every time. And we're still in this spending battle every week. Talk about boring. Every week, it's the same sort of news coming out of Congress, if you follow it, where we can't quite manage to pass a Ukraine aid bill that Biden requested with as an address to the nation at primetime TV in, I think it was October last year. These messages aren't cutting through in terms of foreign policy. And the way that he's framing it, the Summit for Democracy, many people argue, was a disaster. This kind of like message and framing of it being a battle for democracy isn't necessarily working. And it's also especially turning off younger voters. And that is something that Biden needs. He needs a good message for younger voters going into this next year. Something like 80% of, oh, maybe that's not quite right, but is it 80%? 80% of younger voters voted for Biden, not for Trump. Might need to clarify that figure. Come back to me. But Biden won the younger vote by huge margins in 2020. And now when you ask younger people, they're turning off him. And one of the reasons is Biden's approach to Gaza. It's an incredibly live issue. And so the way that Biden navigates that in his State of the Union address is something that I'm certainly going to be watching quite closely because it will say something about his strategy. But in terms of this kind of democracy framing, that's also a winning strategy for Biden in terms of drawing distinctions from himself and Donald Trump. From the minute Trump won New Hampshire, Biden came out and said, look, it's very clear democracy is on the line. And that was his message in 2020. And I think that's going to be his message again in 2024. And so this State of the Union address, I think we're going to be seeing what his second term agenda might be like, but that actually might be more muted because that second term agenda, and I'm sure someone else can talk about the economy, but that in terms of that second term agenda, there's lots of hot button issues that I think are potentially too dangerous to step on ahead of an election year.
And I mean, you mentioned the economy toward the end of it, which is something I wanted to talk about. Although now it seems like Biden is pivoting away from it, but he was having this focus on Bidenomics in his campaign and, you know, the economic track record, which, I mean, the stats, the facts and figures were on his side. The economy was performing well and way above expectation. But that just didn't seem to cut through and be mirrored in terms of what the voters on the ground were experiencing or what they perceived about the performance of the economy. So it seems like he's pivot away from that maybe in his messaging, but if he tries to make an economic play, is there a way that would cut through and that would work, or does he need to focus on this, you know, democracy is on the line, the future is on the line? Does it all just have to circle around Trump, or is there anything around his economic track record?
What in terms of Bidenomics, I think we've heard they've sort of, as you said, stopped using that term, but Brian Deese was the former director of the National Economic Council, Biden's National Economic Council. He defined Bidenomics as, and what I imagine Biden wants to say all the time is three things. One, a strong labor market recovery, especially after COVID. Two, public investment in strategic sectors, including $2.4 trillion in funding in their industry strategy. And three, more competition in antitrust policy. Who cares? Why would, like, those terms do not resonate with those low information voters that I mentioned before. What you have when you're those low information voters, who I said will largely dictate the election, is their lived experience. When they go to the grocery store, are things more expensive than they were a year ago? More often than not, yes. inflation has only started going down. And wages have only eclipsed inflation in the last couple months. So it's important to note that those who think that the economy right now in America is excellent is 2%. In the middle of 2019, just before COVID, it was 28%. You can't overcome those numbers very easily unless you make it about more than just the economy. And on that, there's actually really interesting polling that New York Times and Siena College did on democracy. Because what we find is, as you said, when you actually talk about democracy in a poll and say, do you care about democracy? It's like, yeah, they do, but they don't care that much. But explicitly. But what they did in swing states in the New York Times and Siena is that they actually tested those hypothetical candidates that David was talking about before. Would you vote for a candidate that was saying the 2020 election was rigged versus a candidate who said, let's move forward? And they did all sorts of experiments. And I love survey experiments. If you ever heard any of our sort of presentations in our surveys, I love experiments because you actually get to people's real views. And what they found is that even though people said in the poll they don't care about democracy, when given an experiment of would you vote for a candidate who said the 2020 election did not happen, the support for that candidate is significantly lower than those who don't talk about the 2020 election. So maybe people implicitly care about democracy, but it's not explicit.
Mm.
And so I think Biden's going to pivot, but what I don't understand and why it baffles me every time I hear it is they need to get the message. It's a messaging thing.
Yeah.
You can't convince people their lives are better than the way they feel about their lives. Their lived experience has not changed all that dramatically.
Hmm. Okay.
Yeah, I completely agree with Jared. And Tressie McMillan Cotton had a very good analysis of this in the New York Times a couple of months ago, where she pointed out that just how hard it is to get and pay for a lot of essential services in the United States. So especially now that the work from home era is over, more and more people are having to go back to work. That means that there is huge and spiking demand for childcare, for in-home health aides, for transport, all things that are increasingly difficult to get in the United States. Part of the economic story is that unemployment is very low, which means that people who have been in these historically badly paid, low status, but absolutely necessary kinds of occupations around childcare, home health care, and transport are now leaving for other sectors, which makes it it's basically very hard to have a job and have a life at the same time in the United States. And that's not a problem that economic growth is going to solve. Economic growth is going to make some aspects of that worse, at least in the short term. Maybe in the long term, it will all even out. As Jared pointed out, inflation is going down now. Wages are beginning to catch up, but people can still remember what prices were like 1, 2, 3 years ago, and it was 20% lower. And some prices aren't going down. Food is still actually quite high. Having said all that, for the last 2 months in a row, the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Survey has actually shown rapidly rising consumer sentiment, which some people are seeing as this is, perceptions finally catching up, especially since wages are beginning to increase. One note of caution about that is the December increase, which was 14%, was almost exactly the same number of people, the increase in the number of people who thought that there was going to be a new president in 2025. But another thing to keep in mind is one of the major stories of last year was the number of successful strikes across a very wide range of sectors in the United States. You had the auto workers going on strike and getting a historically good deal as a result. On the other side of the country, you had Hollywood screenwriters and actors going on strike and getting a very good deal. I was in Los Angeles while the hotel strike was going on, and I was staying in a union hotel, which had a deal with union. But walking past all of these other hotels, it was very militant stuff, even at 10 at night. At that point, they were no longer chanting. What they were doing was sitting on the steps of their hotels, banging drums and playing recorders. I mean, they were really serious about making life very uncomfortable for the hotels. And these industrial actions were all successful. And what they were all about was the cost of living. It was about the fact that just almost nobody at that point had an agreement with their employer, which took into the reality of how much costs of living had increased, especially in major cities where housing is also a major issue. Healthcare, price of healthcare continues to be a major issue in the United States. So even though in many ways those union actions were something that the Democratic Party would look at as a success, Biden is the first president possibly ever to go and actually join a picket line. You might have seen just a couple of days ago, he finally got the endorsement of the United Auto Workers, who had been very cleverly actually withholding their endorsement. For some reason, unions have got a lot smarter in the US over the last few years, and it's mirrored in their strategies now. They've realized that just negotiating with one employer at a time doesn't work. You need to negotiate across an entire sector. Maybe they've been looking at the way that we do it here. I don't know. But so even though that's a success for the Democratic Party, at the same time, it also shows that basically the only way to get what you actually need in this economy is to go on strike. So it's not an entirely great story.
All right, I've got just a couple other questions before we hand it over to audience questions. But we've talked then really what's at stake for the American people and what they're perceiving. I want to know what you think is at stake for Australia. And we've got this many people here interested following the US election. And I'm keen to know, like, really, what do you think with these two likely candidates? So let's assume it's Trump and Biden as the candidates. What is at stake for the people in this room as we look toward the election in November? Yeah, how about you, Jared?
So in terms of, I mean, we sort of know what Biden's going to do, and those there's a great podcast called Hacks on Tap, where you have Republican or non-MAGA Republican pollsters with some Democratic pollsters talking about what Biden needs to do and how Biden needs to provide a positive agenda, because all he keeps doing is talking about a messaging problem, as I mentioned before, but you need to be future looking. With Trump, as David said, it's always going to be 2020. It's always going to be looking in the past. But in terms of what Australia can learn and what Australia can expect, I think I'm always surprised when Australians are surprised about this fact, or opinion, I should say. No country that is a US ally did better under Donald Trump than Australia. Look at even Israel. With Israel, it was a political tool, and he gave Israel land that they didn't even really want. It was a political cudgel to win support. So I think Australia is doing really well in a second Trump term. That doesn't mean it's easy, especially with the Labour government, but I think Australia does particularly well, better than others, with a Trump administration. Where's the Republican Party on Australia and what it's doing? They're largely in support of Australia. What Australia is doing in terms of standing up to China, the way Australia is in their view, investing unprecedented amounts in its defense. Look at even AUKUS. A lot of people, again, I'm shocked that people are surprised by this, but they think that Trump is going to kill AUKUS. Why would he kill it? It is a deal that Australia gives money to America, buys things. I mean, you're going to see some folks like Bridge Colby, who is a sort of conservative defense official who will likely be in a second Trump administration, saying that AUKUS isn't great because U.S. doesn't have the capacity to sell submarines. There's an easy workaround for that, and that is for the U.S. to just spend more on its military and its defense industrial base. Once you deal with that, then everyone's in support of U.S. allies spending more in the military and standing up to China. I don't see how Australia fares like systemically, broadly, terribly under a Trump administration. I do see it being a headache, especially for a Labor government, where just like we saw when Trump was in office, with every sitting politician, a microphone from a media person saying, Trump just tweeted, excuse me, I'm sorry, Trump just tweeted this terrible thing. What do you think? How is Albanese going to respond to that? How is Albanese going to respond to his own cabinet with an issue, with something that is perceived as racist, as sexist? You never know what Trump is going to do. And so I think the sort of discipline required to manage Trump, it's harder than ever, but I think from an institutional, from broad perspective, Australia does better than ever.
Yeah, I mean, so I pulled out some polling that we did this year or last year, sorry. Oh my gosh, it's 2024. 2023, 45% of Australians said that a second Donald Trump term would be a bad or very bad thing for their country versus only 22% who said the same for Joe Biden. And when it comes to hypothetically withdrawing from the United States alliance, if Donald Trump is re-elected in Australia, 37% agree versus 44% who disagree. So there's actually quite a small gap between Australians, or it's almost even with Australians who say we should withdraw from the United States versus stay with the United States if Donald Trump is re-elected. And if Biden is re-elected, you know, the vast majority say that Australia should stay with the United States. So while the Australia writ large may not fare too terribly, as Jared says, under a second Trump administration, I don't think that's necessarily what the Australian public is signaling that they want, considering that, you know, almost even numbers would say they would rather withdraw from the US alliance than remain with the US alliance if Donald Trump is elected. I think what the first Trump administration did do, and while Jared says, yeah, we didn't fare too badly, it did force Australia to step up and to consider its role in especially the Indo-Pacific. On day, I think, 3 of the Trump administration, he withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords. He withdrew from the comprehensive CPTPP, the Comprehensive Partnership on Trade, Trans-Pacific Partnership,
Trans-Pacific Partnership,
which is now, oh, sorry, TPP.
Yeah.
Now we have CPTPP. Yeah. The analogies are too much. And now we also have IPEF. And it'll be interesting to see if anything happens with that under a second Trump administration. But I think all of those things were shocks to the system, for Australia especially. And while we may not have fared too terribly, you know, we saw Australia had workarounds in the US-China trade war, for example. It forced us to have a look at our role in the region. And I think a second Trump administration would do much the same. I think they're always good pulse checks for the US-Australian relationship to look for areas where we disagree and areas where we cooperate and where we need to double down, and where Australia itself needs to step up in its own foreign policy to maintain relationships in the region that it's otherwise looking to the United States to assist with. I think that is one thing, but I think the sentiment of the Australian public around the United States is going to be perhaps more than a headache for Australian officials and Australian politicians. We're already seeing some of that discourse around Australia's response to Gaza and how that's been mirroring the United States and the disagreement that's coming around there. I think Australia is going to have a lot of hard conversations about its relationship with the United States if Trump is re-elected. And I think if Biden is re-elected, it'll probably putt along as it already is.
If I can just add one thing, I just wanted to confirm the stats on this. So Victoria shared some great polling that we did, but to be fair to other pollsters, Lowy also asked about whether Australia should distance itself from a Trump-led America or not in 2016, 2017, 2018. In 2016, 45% of Australians said they should distance themselves from the United States if it elects President Trump. By 2018, it went from 45 to 31%. I think Australians, there's a good 30 to 35%, even maybe as up to 40 against Trump. But I think if you look at that polling, as well as polling on support for the US alliance, the elephant in the room is China. And yes, from looking at polls, China, you know, Trump is not popular in Australia by any means. And your average, your sort of 90% of liberal voters in Australia are more progressive than your median Trump voter. Literally, we tested that. Yeah, 90%. But that doesn't mean that they want to distance themselves throughout the alliance altogether.
Now I want to do one quick lightning round before we go to audience questions. So I just want to hear from each of you down the line, who you think would be maybe most likely for a vice presidential candidate for Donald Trump, and briefly why or why not. I might start with David if you're okay. Otherwise, I'll pivot to Jared and throw him under the bus.
Well, thing is that you can think about this from the perspective of conventional political strategy, and you would think someone like Elise Stefanik, who I mentioned. I mean, you think, given Trump's problems with women, that it would be very sensible for him to have a woman in there. But you know, who knows? There are a lot of people trying to position themselves. So Kari Lake, the failed Arizona gubernatorial candidate and one of the most insane people in the country, is disconcertingly close. Marjorie Taylor Greene seems to be somebody else who's been positioning herself for this. But then actually looking just at the last few weeks in South Carolina, Tim Scott, a failed presidential candidate, South Carolina senator, is positioning himself next to Trump. But like, who knows who Trump would pick? That's as far as I'm prepared to go.
How about you, Victoria?
Oh, it's a question you can't really do lightning round with. I think like you can see who wants it. Like the New Hampshire speech afterward, where I think Donald Trump even looked at Vivek Ramaswamy and said, "Go get him, Vivek." And like Vivek had his like moment in front of the microphone, which was, I'm sure, very exciting for him. But they were all crowded around him, and there's now this like kind of betting competition about who's going to be Trump's vice president. Trump is so unpredictable; it's so hard to know. But in terms of Joe Biden, I think at this stage it is looking like Kamala Harris is likely to be his VP pick. Safe bet.
Yeah. Put money on that one. Okay. How about you, Jared?
I remember back in 2020 talking to some Dems, asking about other VP noms besides Kamala Harris. And they're like, yeah, that's interesting, but it's Kamala. They knew for weeks, if not months, it was going to be her. Trump will not know for weeks or months, I would gamble, because he loves the intrigue. He loves the attention. So I would be surprised if he announces anytime soon who his VP nom will be, or anytime sooner than he absolutely needs to. Now, in terms of who that person will be, I think just looking at the polls, looking at demographics, looking at which demographics he needs to win, there's no question that there's one candidate in particular who would bolster him more than anyone else: Nikki Haley. Absolutely. A woman, non-white descent, and seen as a moderate. He is terrible with all of those three groups, but it doesn't look like she wants to have it. It doesn't look like maybe Trump would accept her. But in terms of the others, as David said, he's going to have all these names forever. And he loves those candidates coming to him and endorsing him and praising him. If you remember in 2016, or I should say 2016, 2017, when he won, having all those candidates, including Mitt Romney, coming, trying to see if they'd be in his cabinet or not. He loves the affection. He loves the attention. So I think we don't know for sure, and he doesn't, and Trump doesn't know, but we can be sure that he will make a spectacle of it regardless.
Okay, thank you. All right, over to you. Who wants to go first with the first brave question? How about you here, sir? Thank you. They'll bring a microphone to you. And if you could speak into the microphone, we've got a big room, so that'll make sure everyone in the room can hear you.
Good evening. Richard Bronowski, a former Australian diplomat. I hope that Stefanik is not picked by Trump, because she gave a thoroughly dishonest interpretation and interrogation of Claudine Gay in the Republican in the Congress. And in my view, Claudine should have stuck up for her principles, academic honesty, and stayed there. It's a shame. My question is this: if Trump is elected, I think you're probably giving him a bit of a mum rap. Trump is one of two US presidents in post-war American history who didn't declare a war. Jimmy Carter is the other one. Trump had met Kim Jong-un, which is an unprecedented thing to do. He's transactional. He doesn't seem to have any principles. but he could be well the one who torpedoes AUKUS, which in my view would be a very good thing. What's your comment on that?
Who wants to take that?
I'm happy to take it. Yeah, I mean, what's the one thing we can predict about Trump that is unpredictable, right? So he very well may torpedo AUKUS, but if you just look at the way that, I mean, look at Taiwan. You can see again in the publication that Mari talked about at the beginning today, how we have a tracker of where Trump stands on issues. But we went out of our way on that tracker to just include Trump's quotes, him directly. But it's fairly well known that Trump has said he sees no value of defending Taiwan. He said that off the record. Vivek Ramaswamy's take on Taiwan, which I believe is we take all their semiconductor manufacturing and then we just let them get eaten up by China. I think that's not too far away from where Trump is on Taiwan. So a lot of people would like to say that Trump is stronger on China than Biden would have been. I think maybe rhetorically he would have been stronger on China in some ways, but he was always looking for a deal. And I think if Trump sees a deal to be had with China, he may go for it. But with that said, the rest of the Republican Party, I don't see going for it in the same way. Those Senate Republicans, when he told Senate Republicans that he saw no value in defending Taiwan, they went out of their way to try to institutionalize more support for Taiwan. So I think he's going to, as much as he owns the Republican Party, the Senate Republicans in particular are going to go out of their way to maintain AUKUS and a stronger and more bolstered approach to China.
Okay, next question. Yeah, I'll go to the lady in the second row there. Just bring you a microphone. Thank you.
If working,
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
on.
it's on.
if Trump wins, what do you think he will do in relation to the Israel-Gaza situation?
I'll just repeat that in case it was a bit quiet, but it's if Trump does win the election, what do we think he'll do in relation to what's happening in Israel and Gaza?
Yeah, that's right.
Actually, Jared's our probably best Middle East expert on staff at the moment. So are you happy to handle that one
Sure.
first as well?
Yeah, I think the audience members said he'll solve it in a few hours. I think that's every problem. He said he'd solve it in a few hours. Ukraine also would be solved. So would government debt that has increased over the decades. That they're all going to be solved within hours. I mentioned this before, how Israel was a political tool for Trump. Moving the embassy to Jerusalem, that was a political tool. The way that they went out of their way to get the right-wing Likud party in Israel went out of its way to name Trump, put Trump's name on everything. It was a very transactional relationship that you had between the Netanyahu government and the Trump administration. So in terms of what happens with Israel, depends how much longer Netanyahu is in office. That's a constant question about whether are we talking weeks, are we talking months, or something somehow changes or years, because right now Israeli approval of Netanyahu is pretty low. Actually, it's really never been worse, but but there are some saying he's a sort of wartime commander. So there are so many moving parts, it's hard to know, but we do know, as I said before, there's some certainties with Trump beyond being uncertain, is that he will seek to leverage that US-Israeli relationship in any way he can for political gain. So is it doing more things in Jerusalem instead of Tel Aviv? Is it getting the Netanyahu for an official state visit if Netanyahu is in office? I think the one thing we should know is that this is not the US-Israeli relationship that it was maybe 20, 30 years ago, which was bipartisan in the US part, and not just politically in DC, but also across the country. It has never been more politicized, the US opinion of Israel, since I would argue the formation of Israel.
Okay, did I see a hand over here? Yeah, can we come to the gentleman in the front corner, please?
So what I wanted to ask about was basically about the Taiwan issue. if Trump does get reelected, I think we've seen a growing movement in the MAGA base of Trump. That it's largely very isolationist. Most of the MAGA candidates were debating on how isolationist they can be. I think if war does break out in the Southeast China Sea, and Trump is reelected, and America pulls out, I think Australia might have to look at its relationship and pull away from America as a reliable ally. I mean, we've already seen that with NATO and Afghanistan when it pulled out. So what do you think about that, basically?
Okay, so looking at Taiwan contingencies, actually, Victoria, I might go to you first because I know you were looking at the polling, and we've asked some pretty specific questions around what might happen in Taiwan and sentiment across the United States, Australia, and Japan, as well as included in our polling. So I thought that might be a good place to start on a very complex issue.
Yeah, I have a polling report from last year available here, which is also available online if you'd like to fact check my numbers, because maths on the fly is not always my strong point. But yeah, we asked about Taiwan contingencies, so various scenarios that might happen, and how Australians, Americans, and also Japanese respondents what they would agree or disagree with their countries doing in order to defend Taiwan or not defend Taiwan. So we asked, would you send military forces to help the United States defend Taiwan, provide Taiwan with weapons, or economically isolate China? And for each of those options, Australia was far and away more supportive of their government getting involved, either sending military forces, providing Taiwan with weapons, or economically isolating China, than both US and Japanese respondents. So Australians are always seemingly more prepared to be involved, especially in our near region, than the United States is. And that's kind of what I was referring to earlier when I was talking about this sense of isolationism that's kind of growing in the United States. I think that's not only a Trump potentially MAGA talking point that definitely won him support in the 2016 election, but we've also kind of seen that in Biden withdrawing from Afghanistan, but also, you know, his personal connection with his son and his involvement in wars. Biden would say things like, you know, call your mother and ask. That's a good idea when it comes to getting involved in the wars. And I think that's something that Biden has shown restraint with in his foreign policy so far. But now I've completely forgotten the part of your question about what Trump would do in terms Taiwan.
And if it's, you know, Trump or Biden, I guess if we think about what happens then, so we've got the Australian public sentiment toward it, but then if Trump, if we marry up a Trump presidency or I guess a Biden administration as well, what impact would that have?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. I think something we haven't talked about, we've talked about BPs, but we haven't talked about administration officials. And I think that will make a big difference for Donald Trump in terms of who he installs in his administration, and will be advising him on these issues. I mean, his sentiment on Taiwan and every international relations issue has changed. When it comes to Biden, that's also true on the topic of Taiwan. So yeah, I think it's going to be up in the air. We're going to have to see. But in terms of Australia's response to that, if we're alluding to that, I think yeah, I think when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, Australia seems to be more readily involved, whereas we've been talking about the pivot to the Indo-Pacific for a long time under America.
If the US does pull out, and I think the US being the main force in the Pacific to actually give depth and control of this region. I think like if Canada has been war, will we have to see Canada has been increasingly out the religion front?
Might be on for you.
Yeah, so I think we've been polling on Taiwan for a while, and also in the US, Japan, and Australia. As Victoria said, Australia is largely in support of defending Taiwan. But also, I think it's important to note that as much as Trump may say he doesn't want to defend Taiwan, support for defending Taiwan in Japan remains robust. The Japanese and increasingly Koreans, but also Australians, really see Taiwan as a major issue for them. It's not because Taiwan is a democracy. It is in their national self-interest to stop Taiwan being. This gets into the bombs and rockets stuff that I'm not an expert in, but it gets into the force projection that China can have if they have Taiwan. It completely changes the security of the region. And that is simply in the eyes of, they never say it maybe officially and publicly, but in the eyes of leaders in Korea, Japan, Philippines, they really see it almost as an existential threat to them. So I think we may not see explicit voices of support, and we may not hear, except for maybe, for instance, from Joe Biden, explicit voices of support for Taiwan in the U.S. But I don't think I don't think you can overestimate just how important Taiwan is in the eyes of military strategists.
Mm. And now I think I saw a hand over there. The lady in black. We'll go to you for the next question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your expertise and insights. David, you said at the beginning, and I know you were referring to the weather, that there's nothing between Ohio and the pole. There is, of course, Canada. One place that is in between. And I wonder what is at stake for Canada. Is there anything at stake or not? So yeah. What about the close neighbor?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that there's I meant that there aren't any mountains or anything to intervene. It's basically just just prairie. Canada is in a very interesting situation with the United States, and Canada, even more so than Australia, I think, has this relationship with the US that doesn't change that much between administrations, because that's how they need to survive. And I think during the Trump administration, it's interesting that even though the single biggest symbolic trade issue and real material trade issue to Americans, the one they hated the most was NAFTA. So ever since 1992, a lot of Americans had felt really left behind by NAFTA. They were completely suspicious of the intentions behind it. And yet it really wasn't until Trump that a major party candidate actually came along to take NAFTA on. And that was one of the major reasons why he won in the upper Midwest. What did he actually do to NAFTA? Basically, he changed the name of it. It's no longer North American Free Trade Agreement. It's US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. There actually were some gains to the United States. As far as Canada was concerned, the US got more access to Canada's dairy market, which, I mean, that sort of really reflected the kind of lobbying that was going on inside the US. But fundamentally, NAFTA was actually left in place by Trump. And to go to Jared's point about Australia and Australia's relationship under Trump, once again, you basically had this picture of stability. Now, I disagree with Jared that Australia did better than any other ally. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates made out like bandits, literally, in many cases. The largesse that was, and the political favors and the looking the other way at everything that they did that was lavished on them by Trump was one of the worst things about his foreign policy. We have to remember, Congress twice actually managed to unite to veto the fact that the US was continuing to support this just absolutely horrific war in Yemen being waged by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, though they didn't have the votes then to override Trump's veto. But going back to Australia, Australia didn't attract Trump's attention very much, no matter how many rounds of golf Joe Hockey played with Trump. Really, Trump didn't care about Australia because the US was running a trade surplus with Australia. Every other ally was, the US had a trade deficit with them, and that's why Trump was getting upset with them. The one area where we did have where we had a surplus with the US, once he found out about that, he got very upset. Now, it was largely the Australia lobby in Congress that managed to head that off at the path. And we should be very glad about that because aluminium is pronounced aluminum in the United States. So we would have had not just a trade war, but a pronunciation war. But the point is, just Australia didn't attract Trump's attention very much. And we were in this good position because we have a trade deficit. Canada, I think, has an even, as I said, by necessity, basically has an even more stable relationship with the United States. And if you look through the sweep of Canadian history about the fact that they did not back the United States in Vietnam, they didn't back the United States in Iraq, the relationship just continues. I think that there's nobody better at managing that relationship than the Canadians.
If I, sorry, one second.
Wow.
If I can just quickly follow up on that. I agree that maybe UAE and Saudi did well, but you also have the danger with Trump of flying too close to the sun in the way that Netanyahu did. That's why look at Biden's handling of Saudi Arabia and look at Biden's handling of Israel. So yes, they both did well under the Trump administration, but they do not have the bipartisan support that Australia has. That's what I mean in terms of doing well in the long term. AUKUS is a major investment and a major risk. And there is really no question about whether Australia should get nuclear powered submarines, but just a question of how. So that's what I mean by in terms of Australia doing better than others. Sorry.
Okay, now we're going to have to wrap it soon, but I want to get to as many questions as we can. So I'm going to ask you to keep it brief and we'll try and do what we can to get to these questions. I'll go to the lady in pink there, please.
Thanks very much. Just interested in your views on the regular commentary about and examples of an apparent decline in Trump's mental acuity, or is it just more examples of his poor being very inarticulate?
Well, when you look at the way that Biden and Trump have been treated on this, it's very interesting that there's so much commentary on Biden. Partly because he stumbles when he makes mistakes, he stops, it's very obvious. Trump has got away with a lot of this because there's just this constant stream of words. That makes a huge, huge difference. I don't think that either of them are at the top of their game at the moment. Some of Trump's recent stumbles have been disturbing. When he quite clearly was confusing Nikki Haley with Nancy Pelosi. That was there were barriers in his brain that were being permeated there. I mean, we should observe the Goldwater rule, which is you can't diagnose somebody from a distance unless they actually sit down and take a battery of tests. But as Mary Trump, Trump's niece and a psychiatrist pointed out, Trump is never going to sit down and take those tests.
All right. And now I saw the gentleman in blue over there.
My question is about the topic of many Republican debates, the southern borders, and which is currently escalating apparently. And I've heard that the Texas governor said that daily over 50,000 illegal immigrants are entering the United States. And why do you think Biden administration, Biden government doesn't take this seriously? I mean, from my point of view, and how do you think this would impact the election?
Okay, immigration, who wants to tackle?
I wouldn't say they don't take it seriously. I think they do take it seriously. I think that the problem is that the United States has needed immigration reform for 30 years, which has gone nowhere in Congress. At the moment, Democrats are offering Republicans a deal beyond their wildest dreams when it comes to the border, which is re-implementing most of the Trump era border controls, which is basically almost dismantling the system of asylum entirely, without demanding in return the thing that Democrats have always demanded, which is a path to citizenship for people who are already there. Democrats have put this offer on the table because of the fact that, first of all, they desperately want to get continuing funding for Ukraine, and second, because they see it as a serious political liability for Biden. Senate Republicans have jumped at this opportunity. Lindsey Graham, among others, has said Republicans are never going to get another deal like this because even if Trump wins the presidency, unless Republicans get a veto-proof majority in the Senate, they are not getting that deal again. This deal is going to die in the House because Trump has said, you can't do this because this would be helping Joe Biden. And Republicans in the House have come out and said, we can't do this because it's helping Joe Biden. And frankly, they've done an enormous political service of showing us how little they actually care about this issue, except for them as an index of how the left is supposedly destroying America.
All right, so, sorry.
Sorry, very quickly. When Clinton in the 90s took on welfare reform and said the era of big government is over, that effectively dealt with a huge liability for him electorally. And the Republicans were not able to run on it because he cut the size of the government significantly, actually larger than any president since. If Biden, as David said, were able to take on immigration and nip that in the bud, that would be by far, assuming inflation stays the same, the #1 electoral concern for him. But again, as David said, I don't see the Republicans giving that to him, regardless of what proposal the Democrats put on the table.
Okay, now to wrap it quickly, I'm just going to try and grab 3 questions all at once and then ask our experts to quickly grab that. So I'll grab the gentleman with the tie, the lady in blue, and the lady with stripes, just to, they're in a line, so I'll make it quick. So yeah, we'll grab those all at one go, very quick, keep it brief, and then I'll have our experts answer it.
Okay, just coming back, thank you, to Jared on foreign policy. Taiwan. Both the United States and Australia recognize that Taiwan is a province of China. The fact is that that Trump has made it clear that A, he doesn't like alliances, and B, he said just last Sunday that the United States should not come to Taiwan's defense if China attacks it. Now, on those 2 points, he finds there is a lot of common feeling with Australia. I doubt very much that an Australian government will go to war over Taiwan in spite of what you say. And we are not the same as Japan in that regard. And I would be very surprised if the present government would not be quite happy with Trump on that particular point.
Okay, so we'll touch on Taiwan. Could you pass the microphone to the lady in blue in the row behind? Thank you. And we'll grab that question too.
Thank you. Do you think after the initial overturning of Roe versus Wade, that seemed to be a possible catalyst for the Democrats to get some demographics involved that are usually not that involved? That seems to have died down. Do you think that will pop up again later in the campaign?
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll grab.
Well, that's effectively my question. I want to know, are the Democrats going to bash every Republican candidate up and down the ballot on the issue of abortion? And what influence do you think that might have? Is that going to be, a more impactful issue than it has been in previous presidential elections this time?
Okay, thank you. So to wrap it up, let's touch briefly on Taiwan first, again, in terms of what that contingency looks like, especially under a Trump administration, and then we'll end it on abortion.
Okay, I'll quickly do Taiwan. An invasion of Taiwan it's not an on-off switch. And a response to an invasion of Taiwan is not an on-off switch. We deliberately asked our questions to give opportunity for folks to say, do they want to economically isolate Taiwan? Do they want to arm Taiwan? It's not just, yes, we're sending boots on the ground, Australian lives at stake in Taiwan, or no, we're letting Taiwan to just wither and die. I think when I say defense of Taiwan, that is an all-encompassing defense of Taiwan. I think we need to not think of just like, yeah, Australia is going to send boots on the ground, even if the US doesn't. No one's saying that. I think we deliberately used verbiage in our polls to talk about joining the US in defending Taiwan. And we would never, I don't think we would see a situation in which, yeah, Australia goes alone, but that's not necessarily what I'm talking about. What I think defending Taiwan, supporting Taiwan, Australian boots are not on the ground in Ukraine, but they're still supporting Ukraine, right? There are degrees of support of Taiwan that I think we need to pay attention to. Then on Roe v. Wade, I think Democrats will go out of their way to put on every single ballot they can. That's obvious. That is political logic 101. And to anything, put it on the ballot.
All right, yeah.
Yeah, my
Victoria?
one comment just to add on, Jared, is not that not a policy position on abortion and what should happen, but pointing out that Trump was the one to by proxy eliminate Roe v. Wade and therefore is a threat to democracy. I think they're kind of marrying those two issues together.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg always warned that Roe versus Wade was a very fragile basis for abortion rights in the United States, and that in the end there would need to be a political solution. And I think that it's going to take a long time, but that's what Democrats are ultimately going to have to push for. And at the moment, it is a winning issue for them politically. So I don't quite know how that will play out in the election. But this actually is an issue of the future. Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank you all very much for coming out tonight, giving up your time to be with us. We greatly appreciate it. And I want to thank our crew, Janine, Becky, Gopika, for your help with pulling off this event tonight. There's going to be so much more happening on US politics with the USSC this year. So please follow us on, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. Subscribe to our newsletters, especially the 46th, if you like what you heard here tonight, and check out our USSC Briefing Room podcast. Please join me in thanking David, Victoria.